Well, members of the Asian American community say they are living in fear. The shootings in Atlanta come amid a surge of violence against Asians nationwide. Tonight, we're joined by activist and actress Tamlyn Tomita and legal expert Anthony Nguyen. Tamlyn has been a big voice as attacks surged during this pandemic. But first, we begin with attorney Anthony Nguyen. And Anthony, you just heard what Georgia considers a hate crime. If you were in Georgia, speak to the challenge of pursuing a hate crime against this only suspect.
Good evening, Susan. I think the issue that we probably see in Georgia, just like with other jurisdictions, when there is reluctance to label something as a hate crime, I think that relates to the prosecution of the claims themselves, because when we're talking about a hate crime, it's a very narrow definition. In other words, it's a criminal act that's motivated by race or by gender or some other protected category. So I think the concern that you probably see in these situations is that the prosecution doesn't want to not only have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime was intentionally committed, but that it was also intentionally committed because of race or because of gender. Because when we're dealing with a criminal action, why add that extra possible doubt for the prosecution to have to deal with in trying to convict the defendant?
All right, Tamlyn, you're not an attorney. Perhaps you've played one on TV, but you can certainly speak to why there is a growing groundswell of people who say, absolutely, how can you say this wasn't a hate crime?
Because we recognize it. We recognize these kinds of behaviors from persons who accost us on the street, in the grocery store, at the Home Depot, when we recognize the visceral kind of anger and hatred and vitriol that's spat upon us literally because of just entirely on the way we look. We are not surprised. We are afraid. We are going through grief and trauma. We're realizing that we're not paranoid, that this is real, and we're all being galvanized, as you said, Susan, earlier, energized at the fact that we're all seeing so many voices collecting together in unison to fight back against this virus, which is racism and misogyny.
And Tamlyn, your father was interned in Manzanar during World War II. There was a word that was often used among the community, gaman. This is not a time for gaman, correct?
True.
And tell us what that means.
Of the Japanese word, gaman means to endure. And for Asian Americans, and specifically at this point, Asian American women, we've been told to swallow the racist attacks, the comments, the snide, flirtatious comments that have been spewed against us. And we swallow that pill, and gaman means literally to endure, to just push it down, not talk about it, be strong, be resilient, and carry on with life. That's not a word that we're hearing anymore. It's to speak out, to speak up, to speak loudly, and to stand in unison with others who experience this kind of racism based on hate.
And Anthony, we've talked a lot about the fact that we saw this surge in violence against Asian Americans during the pandemic, but in fact, it has persisted over generations. Some of it kind of more like a microaggression. Can you address that and explain for people who may not understand what this kind of subtle racism looks like?
Sure. I think sometimes when we think about hate crimes or acts of hate, we think about it in the big picture context, an overt, large act that gets news headlines like what we saw in Georgia. But I think it's important to remember that it usually doesn't start with something big like that. It starts with something much smaller, a microtransgression, a incident that's motivated by race, by ignorance. And if we don't speak up about those issues, if we don't talk about those issues, then what we'll see is that those small little racially motivated acts become acts like what we saw in Georgia. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of.
It's complicated by the fact that there are a lot of things that women can identify with in this crime, Tamlyn, and so it's so complex. I mean, it's race and it's gender, correct?
Yes. Yes, it is it's the intersectionality that is a word that's being used right now as to the ideas that It's the fetishization of women to look at them as sexual objects, and specifically Asian women. That's racist. But also that he went in there to kill all Asians. If we look at the Korean language newspapers that are coming out, witnesses heard this man, this shooter, this murderer say, "I'm here to kill all Asians." And that is misogyny. I mean, that's the misogyny against the women at those day spas. So the intersectionality of racism and misogyny, sexism, we're seeing that how complex of a fight and a struggle that we're all dealing with, and to take them apart. What Andrew was saying about the microaggressions, when there is the children on the playground saying Chinese, Japanese, it grows continually over lifetimes to the point where people out there are repeating the words of our former president, saying that you caused this virus, you're to blame, go back home. It's this consistent, persistent kind of racism that we're all finding the fuel and the anger to fight, finally, together.
Because Asian Americans are not forever foreigners. And Anthony, I'll give you one last question, and that is that phrase, kill all Asians, has not been widely promulgated. If you, as a prosecutor, knew that that was what was said and that is what a witness has said occurred, wouldn't that give you cause to pursue a hate crime?
I'll give one word in response. Absolutely.
Very good. Absolutely. Thank you both for joining us tonight on the 10 o'clock news. I very much appreciate you.
Thank you, Susan.